Forget everything they taught you in Sunday school, and everything you've ever seen painted in the most famous masterpieces in the world. That classic, picture-perfect image of the Last Supper, with 13 European guys sitting on just one side of a long wooden table, posing politely for a camera that didn't even exist, is simply the biggest fake news in art history. Leonardo da Vinci lied to you, and he lied beautifully, because the entire world bought into that illusion for centuries. Historically speaking, Da Vinci's painting makes about as much sense as Jesus pulling a smartphone out of his pocket and ordering a rideshare to escape the Roman soldiers in the Garden of Gethsemane. We are in the 1st century, in Jerusalem, right in the eye of the Roman Empire's hurricane. A dusty, noisy city filled with political tension. High tables made of polished wood and comfortable little chairs with backrests. That was stuff for northern barbarians or European nobles who wouldn't invent that trend until 1,500 years later. The bare, naked truth is that the Last Supper looked nothing like a Thanksgiving dinner or a well-behaved Christmas supper. It looked a lot more like a Roman fraternity banquet, except without the luxurious togas, swapped instead for dusty tunics, and with a farewell vibe that made the air incredibly heavy. And for you to understand what was really going down in that room, you need to swallow a bizarre historical fact about their posture. A tiny logistical detail, but one that completely shifts the visual identity and points exactly to where the true traitor was positioned. They weren't sitting, they were lying down, literally lying on the floor. In the Greco-Roman world of that time, and always remember that Judea was breathing under the boot of Rome, any dinner worth its salt, any official meal, happened on the floor. The architectural layout of the room was called a triclinium. It consisted of 3 low couches, practically mattresses, arranged in a U-shape around a small stone or wooden table practically glued to the floor. The open side of the U was left clear for the servants to bring in the food. Jesus and the apostles were reclining on their left elbows, with their legs stretched out behind them, eating only with their right hands, leaning on cushions. Picture the scene in real life right now. John, the youngest apostle, was lying so close that he was practically on top of Jesus' chest. That's exactly why the original texts say he was leaning against the master's bosom. It wasn't some dramatic, poetic hug from a Mexican soap opera. It was literally a lack of space in the room. Everyone crammed together, sweaty, practically eating in each other's laps. But if the posture already sounds uncomfortable for our elegant dining standards, the menu that night was infinitely more extreme. Because this wasn't some random get-together with warm rolls and smooth wine. It was the night of Pesach, the original Jewish Passover. A night meticulously designed not to be forgotten. On this specific night, the menu had brutal, non-negotiable rules. Culinary rules that involved chewing the taste of the earth, swallowing the salt of tears, and reviving the memory of slaves' sweat in the desert. That meal wasn't made to please the palate. It was designed as a sensory time machine. And the very first course they had to swallow, well before any bread was blessed or broken, is something that would make any modern food critic spit into their napkin and ask for the check on the spot. An appetizer made purely of pain. Picture the scene. You've just laid down on the cold floor. The mood in the room is already tense because the group's leader has spent the last few days talking about betrayal and death. And the first dish they put in front of you is the maror, bitter herbs. And we aren't talking about a gourmet arugula salad with balsamic vinegar. This was wild lettuce, horseradish, pure chicory. The taste was earthy, aggressive, and specifically meant to be unpleasant. Jewish tradition demanded that you chew that so you could feel in your own mouth the bitterness of 400 years of slavery in Egypt. To make matters worse, these herbs were dipped in salt water before eating. The salt water represented the sweat and tears shed by the slaves building for the pharaohs. Literally, the meal began by forcing you to swallow the suffering of your ancestors. If a restaurant did that today, they'd get sued and shut down in the first week. But back there, in the 1st century, it was the ultimate, non-negotiable rule of the night. And it's right after this bitter appetizer that archaeology and theology collide head-on with a detail that changes the entire story of the betrayal. Because exactly next to the plate of suffering, the servants placed a clay bowl filled with a sweet paste called haroset. Haroset was a dense mixture of apples, figs, dates, crushed walnuts, cinnamon, and dark wine. By the smell and the ingredients, it must have easily been the best thing on the table. But visually, it looked like mortar, a dark, thick mud. And that wasn't by accident. That dish represented the mud and clay the Jews used to build the monuments of the Egyptian Empire under the lash of whips. Now, pay close attention to this detail of triclinium culture, the Roman dining room where they were lying down. Nobody reached their arm over 3 or 4 people to grab food. That was considered rude, besides being physically impossible when you're lying on your side propped up on just one elbow. The etiquette rule was simple. You only shared the same dipping bowl with whoever was lying immediately next to you. Remember what Jesus says at the absolute peak of the night's tension? The one who dips his hand into the bowl with me will betray me. Suddenly, the Renaissance painting completely crumbles. Judas Iscariot wasn't sitting way down at the end of the table, isolated in the corner, looking like a villain with a bag of coins hidden in his tunic, just like art always wanted to make you believe. To dip his hand into the same clay bowl as Jesus and share the same sweet paste that looked like mud, Judas had to be in the position of honor. He was lying practically glued to the master. The traitor wasn't some distant figure at the far end of the room. He was the VIP guest, shoulder to shoulder with the man he was going to sell for 30 pieces of silver in just a few hours. The betrayal came from the same dish, on the very same cushion. The level of cynicism and cold blood you need to have to lie on the floor, share the fruit mortar from your master's very own bowl, knowing that the Roman guards are already bribed and waiting for your signal outside, is something terrifying. And no one else in the room realized the gravity of what was happening in that exact second. They thought it was just another traditional Passover dinner, but the clock was ticking. And while the psychological tension hit its absolute limit between Jesus and Judas, the room was suddenly flooded by the strong smell of fat melting into the fire. It was time for the main course, the meat that carried the historical weight of saving the lives of an entire nation. The rule for preparing it was clear, absolute, and allowed 0 mistakes. Not a single bone could be broken. And in the middle of that absurd tension, where traitor and betrayed shared the same clay bowl, the main course finally dominated the room. The Passover lamb, the Korban Pesach. Forget that image of a little baked fish or a gently broken piece of bread. The center of that low table was occupied by a whole lamb, roasted on a pomegranate spit, with its skin crackling, dripping hot fat. And the divine rule was brutal and non-negotiable. Not a single bone of that animal could be broken. The smell of roasted meat with smoke and spices was strong, dense, and permeated the clothes of everyone there. Hours before that dinner, all of Jerusalem smelled like blood and smoke. Tens of thousands of lambs had been sacrificed at the temple. Blood ran through the city's stone channels. That lamb in the center of the room wasn't just food. It was a visceral, almost violent reminder that the angel of death only passed over a house if there was blood on the door. And all of them lying there on the floor, chewing that meat in the heavy silence of the night, knew that the Roman Empire outside was boiling with political tension. The danger was real. Death was just around the corner. And it is exactly in this tense climate, with bellies lined with meat and palates still confused between the bitter and the sweet, that the Christian church would focus all of its attention for the next 2,000 years. The carbs and the alcohol, the bread and the wine. But again, Western art and tradition romanticized everything. When you imagine Jesus breaking bread, you think of a fluffy loaf, a soft baguette, or those wafer-thin communion hosts that melt in your mouth. Erase that from your mind right now. The bread that night was matzah, unleavened bread, without yeast. It wasn't soft. It looked like a giant water cracker, dry, hard, and full of holes. It had no yeast because history said that in Egypt the Jews had to flee running in the middle of the night, and the dough simply didn't have time to rise. Eating the matzah meant chewing the rush, the escape, the despair of a surviving people. The room was stuffy. The smell of meat still hovered. The breathing of 12 anxious men and a leader marked for death echoed off the stone walls. Jesus lifts himself slightly from his left elbow. He takes that flat bread as hard as a roof tile. Silence takes over the triclinium. And then, he snaps the matzah in half. The sound of the dry bread cracking must have snapped loudly in the room. A dry, violent noise, breaking the tension right down the middle. And as the crumbs fell onto the rustic table, he drops the phrase that would redefine the course of Western civilization. "This is my body, which is broken for you." It wasn't a calm and poetic moment. It was the harsh sound of breaking, a clear warning that his body was going to be crushed by the Roman Empire in just a few hours. And after the dry, hard bread, only one thing was left to seal the night: the drink that would wash that taste of earth and death out of their mouths. But the wine that night also hid a brutal secret within its 4 cups. In first-century Judea, wine wasn't this elegant beverage you sip from a fine crystal glass to pair with expensive cheeses. It was a rustic, thick, heavy drink, almost an absurdly strong, fermented syrup that absolutely had to be mixed with water so it wouldn't get everyone drunk and knock them out right at the start of the meal. And on that specific night, the ultimate tradition of the Jewish Passover demanded not 1, not 2, but exactly 4 cups full of wine for every person lying on that stone floor. Each of those cups represented an ancient promise of liberation from the brutal captivity in Egypt. Try to visualize the absurd level of psychological tension inside that enclosed space. The room was lit only by small oil lamps that threw huge, distorted shadows on the walls. They had already chewed the bitter herbs and felt the physical taste of suffering. They had already eaten the sweet paste that resembled the mud of slavery. They had already broken the hard bread of the escape amidst the thick silence. By this point, the alcohol and a lethal exhaustion were starting to hit hard in the blood of 12 exhausted, terrified, confused men being hunted by the Roman system. It's in this exact scenario of exhaustion and dread that the master raises the cup. Historical chronology and original texts suggest that this was the 3rd cup of the night, also known as the cup of redemption. He holds that dark wine, stares at his followers, and decrees in front of everyone that this was his own blood. A blood that would be violently spilled to seal a new, unbreakable contract with humanity. The weight of that phrase in that stuffy room must have been deafening. There was no choir of angels singing or harps playing in the background. There was only the mute shock of rustic men who had just realized that their leader was signing his own death sentence right in front of them. The celebratory feast had just turned into a premature wake. And it is at this very nerve center that the story comes together in a terrifying way. Because, while that 3rd cup was being raised, the position of honor at the table, that strategic spot glued to the master's chest where the food was shared, was already completely empty. Judas Iscariot had already gotten up from the floor. He had already swallowed the fruit mortar and walked out the door into the freezing Jerusalem night. While the apostles drank the cup of redemption and tried to process their imminent mourning, the traitor was hurrying through the city's stone alleys to seal his blood-stained bribe with the priests and fetch the armed guard with swords, spears, and torches. The Last Supper was never a peaceful, clean, brightly lit banquet meant to be framed on a chapel wall or in your home's dining room. It was the densest, most dangerous and revolutionary meal in antiquity. It was a dinner consumed in the dirt on the floor, mixing the taste of earth, lamb fat, and thick wine under the crushing and relentless shadow of the Roman Empire, which forgave absolutely zero rebels. That meeting wasn't the end of a religion. It was the silent spark of a movement that cracked the chronology of the world and humanity's calendar right down the middle. So, the next time you look at Leonardo da Vinci's perfectly symmetrical Renaissance painting, you can even admire the painter's brilliant technique, but your mind now knows the undeniable truth. Real history didn't happen posing for paintings in little wooden chairs. Real history was carved in the dust, the fear, the betrayal, and the courage of a clandestine meeting that changed the planet. If this brutal reality check blew your perspective wide open and you want to keep dissecting and destroying the historical lies they forced you to swallow in school, don't just sit there thinking the job is done. The algorithm only respects those who take action. Subscribe to the channel right now, smash that like button to feed the machine, and comment your theory down below. What other famous historical event are you absolutely certain is a visual lie and you want me to dismantle piece by piece in the next video? I'll see you on the other side of history. I'm out.